Hello, everybody, and welcome to the, actually, what is the 15th year of Studio View Artist Lecture Series, which is, I'm a little surprised that we're not doing, I mean, we are doing something special by having a really great lineup, but maybe we should think about doing some kind of poster or something in the future, because that's a nice accomplishment. Actually, it's been 15 years. So my name is Mel Ziegler, for those that don't know me, and I'm chair of the Visiting Artists Committee. Like I said, this year we have an amazing lineup, and we might be able to work one more person, and we have 3 lined up right now. We have, of course, today's lecturer, Jorgge Menna Barreto. In October, on October 21st, we have Marie Watt, who will be speaking. All of these will be by Zoom, unfortunately, but maybe by next year we might be able to have people in person again. And then Stephanie Saijuko coming in February the 9th. So today's lecture of Jorgge Menna Barreto will soon start, and it'll be introduced by Professor Pavlovich. But I first want to make some acknowledgments. I'd like to express my thanks to the rest of the Visiting Artists Committee, Professor Campos Pons and Patrick de Guerra. Would also like to acknowledge our current chair, Mark Hosford, for his continued support for the lecture series, as well as the Dean of Arts and Science. Most importantly, I think we should thank the Margaret Stonewall Wooldridge. Did I get that right, Mark? It's Margaret Stonewall Wooldridge Hamlet Endowment Fund. And for their support, making it possible, because of the addition of that extra money, it makes it possible for our visiting artists to spend an extra day visiting with the seniors, the senior art majors, individual visits with the senior art majors. So I want to thank everyone. Anyway, I'm very interested, and I don't want to take up a lot of time, so I'm very interested in today's lecture, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Professor Pavlovich, to introduce Professor Menna Barreto, and take it away.
Thank you, Mel. Well, it is my greatest pleasure and honor to introduce Jorgge Menna Barreto, Brazilian artist, whom I met some years ago when our department engaged in a series of artistic projects and exchanges, faculty and some graduate students from University of Sao Paulo. The project was called Conversations, Conversas, and I want to think about this, Jorgge, as a continuation of that project. Your visit here as sort of to put it that way, you were the seed of that collaboration, because you were the one who connected me with Anna and us with Anna, and so on. So I loved hearing then that you also did a project years later with Professor Ziegler at Sand Hills Institute at the Artist Residency that he established in Rushville, and in where you worked on developing a food forest in a semi-arid landscape of Nebraska. And so in your work, you involve communities and work with communities. And in this project, United States Department of Forestry at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln and the Rushville Gordon High School were involved. And I look forward to actually hearing more and learning more about that project. So this participation of communities is important, because in our biosphere, everything is at stake, and it seems that everyone has a stake in it. And the titles of your recent works, such as 1,000 Ecologies, Libraries of Digestion, Dandelion Flowers Ice Cream, The Mushroom at the End of the World, Soup of Biodiversity, among others, evoke a practice that is deeply concerned with climate, ecology, diversity, and our interconnectedness. They point to the importance of seeding, growing, belonging, and transforming. So Jorgge Menna Barreto has a Ph.D. He's a Brazilian artist and educator whose practice and research have been dedicated to site-specific art for over 20 years. In 2014, he worked as a postdoctoral research project fellow at Universidade do Estado de Santa Catarina in Brazil, where he collaborated with a biologist and agronomist to study relations between site-specific art and agroecology centering around agroforestry. In 2020, he completed a second postdoctoral research fellowship at Liverpool John Moores University in England, where he led the work, which led to the work he presented at the Liverpool Biennial in 2021. Menna Barreto approaches site specificity from a critical and South American perspective, having taught, lectured, and written extensively on the subject. He participated in multiple artist residencies, projects, and exhibitions worldwide. In 2016, he took part in the 32nd Sao Paulo Biennial with his award-winning project Restauro, a restaurant set up to work with a complex system of environmental restoration in collaboration with settlements of Brazil landless workers movement. Since 2015, Menna Barreto has been a professor in the art department of Rio de Janeiro State University, and now an assistant professor at the art department at University of UC Santa Santa Barbara? No, I'm sorry, USCS.
Santa Cruz, yeah.
Santa Cruz. Okay, so I want to welcome, and please welcome Jorgge Menna Barreto and his talk. We'll hear you speak, and then we'll open up for questions.
Thank you so much, Vesna, for this introduction, and thank you, Mel, for the invitation. And it's such an honor and pleasure to be here with you today. I wish it was in person, but distance has been an integral part of our thoughts and ideas and art processes nowadays. And I will be speaking a little bit about that too. And for sure, Vesna, this is a continuation of conversations, and that is also a very dear notion for me in my practice, the idea of extensions and of longer temporalities for projects. And so I would also like to speak a little bit about that with you today. So I will begin sharing my screen, and let me do something here too. All right. And then I imagine you can see me well, right? So as Vesna said, the focus for my practice as an artist and as a scholar has been site specificity now for more than 20 years, we can say. And one of the reflections or writings that have really stuck with me during all those years is this quote by Robert Smithson, which I really think reflects and the pulse or the magnet behind site specificity. And what Smithson wrote in 1970 when he was discussing the spiral jetty was, quoting him, and that's what you read in the slide, at that point, I was still not sure what shape my work of art would take. So we have the artist at a moment of doubt and uncertainty, which is a pregnant moment, let's say, for a paradigm shift. And then he continues. I thought of making an island with the help of boats and barges. And then there's a comma that really creates the turning point in this sentence. But in the end, I would let the site determine what I would build. So in the first half of the second sentence, we have the artist with a preconceived idea that he would install on the site, thinking about the site as a neutral support for the artistic gesture. But something happens there after the comma that he will renounce, he will give up on that initial idea of the artist dictating to the land or dictating to the site what it should host, so that he invites the site to determine what he would build. He kind of creates what we could call a collaborative state with the site, and even go a bit farther and think about a listening practice where he will become more permeable or more sponge-like to really receive and be and accept, let's say, and recognize what the site already is, and somehow compose with the site instead of telling the site what it should be. Site specificity becomes a bit more complex in the hands of Smithson when he and this is the spiral jetty that the writing referred to before, when he chooses to install this work in a remote space, far away from the place where it would be received. So the public or the audience was not really meant to go visit the place, since it's not near a city, it's not in an art institution. There is a distance between the reception of the work and the work itself. And in order for the artist to solve that equation, he will theorize about it and create the idea of the non-site, which is quite a revolutionary idea, I would say, when he will think that through film, through photographs, through writing, and through drawings, the work will extend itself and reach the audience in other places. So we can say that the work is not so much centered around the installation itself, but it becomes, it is constituted of extensions, and it becomes an idea that is very dear to me and that I will be speaking about today, of the work of art as a system. The film, the pictures, the writing, and the drawings of the spiral jetty are not just about the spiral jetty, but they are with spiral jetty. They are extensions of the work that constitute the work, and therefore are not submissive to the work, but they compose with the work. So I will begin by talking about a long-term project that I began with Mel Ziegler and the Ziegler family, which who very generously hosted me twice at the Sand Hills Institute in Rushville, as Vesna mentioned, in a project that will eventually result in an agroforestry, working with the high school of Rushville as a starting point. But in 2017, in my first visit to this place, to this beautiful place, as you can see in the picture, I was interested, especially because it's a place of very intense agriculture. I was interested in agriculture. We can read modern agriculture, where we are telling the land what it should produce, right? We're telling the land what cultures will be harvested. I was interested in thinking about food, the food that is spontaneous to the land and that was not cultivated, right? That somehow is responding not only to the human stimulus, but is responding to the whole ecosystem that provides the conditions for that to grow. And in the first days, the plant that really called me and that called my attention, that grew around the house where we were staying, was the nettles, right? The stinging nettles. And it called my attention in interesting ways, because one day I felt it bit me on the leg, and then the next day the other resident showed me that plant and what he had been doing with the plant. And then somehow we can say that that plant gravitated and started speaking to me, we can say. Or to refer back to Smithson's quote, somehow the site began determining what I would do there, and teaching me how to see that place through the perspective of this specific plant that, again, is spontaneous, right? Is a wild edible. So what we did, and together with the trainees that were there with us that year, who came from Vanderbilt, who were Margaret, Lauren, and Ashlyn, we started harvesting the stinging nettles. Of course, we were wearing gloves and, you know, protected, but every now and then we would feel the sting. And we began a process of dehydrating the plants that we harvested. And then after dehydrating them, we would powder them. And we also created the label for the powder. And it became what I have been calling a dehydrated landscape, or an edible non-site. So also following Smithson's idea that we can relate to a place through its extensions, I thought of this of this action as kind of like a photograph of the place. Somehow the plants that grow spontaneously in a place, they also tell the story of that place. They tell the story of the luminosity, of the light, of the humidity, of the water, of the multi-species relationships, and are somehow imprinted with all that information. And also the light, and that's why I call it a photography, because the photosynthetic process is also something I am interested in as a form of documenting or of creating these digestible or edible non-sites of a place. And different from a photograph, when I talk about the edibility of these landscapes, the way we relate to that site is not anymore only through the visual aspect of it, but through what I have been calling a cellular mediation. So once we ingest, once we eat what was spontaneously what spontaneously grew in a certain site, that information of that site will be transferred to my cells. So it is my cells, it is my digestive system that will read that image, and not, let's say, a visual approach to the landscape, right? So it's we can think about the tentacular aspect of our digestive systems, and all those microfolds that we have as tentacles that will spread and read the landscape through what we eat. This notion of food as being a mediator in the relationship society environment was something that I came across in 2014 while I was doing a postdoctoral research in the city of Florianopolis that Vesna also mentioned, which would think about food as a privileged mediator in the relationship society environment. And I will go back to that to introduce my next project, which I call environmental sculpture. It is in Portuguese. You will see why in the end of the presentation. In Portuguese, we say escultura ambiental for environmental sculpture. So as I was saying, it began in 2014 when I was trying to relate site-specific practices or art practices to agroecology, working with an agronomist and a biologist. And this is a drawing that I made in collaboration with a botanical illustrator in the city of São Paulo, in the 31st Biennial of São Paulo, when we were looking at the park where the biennial happens in São Paulo through the eyes of the wild edibles again. This is called the Plantago Major. In English, it's called the plantain, and it is a plant that grows spontaneously in this park. And I was proposing that we looked at that park through the eyes, again, of our digestive systems. I didn't dehydrate these plants. What I did was create what I call the site-specific smoothies, which were distributed at the restaurant of the event. And that is the little green bottle that you find next to the water and the Coca-Cola bottle. In that picture, we see the starting insight that I had to consider our digestive systems as sculpting tools. This is a picture of the Amazon forest in Brazil, and it shows how a simplified landscape, a monocultural landscape that is usually used for cattle and for soybean monoculture, how it is gradually replacing the landscape, the complex landscape of the forest, multi-species. And up to 90% of the devastation or the deforestation of the Amazon forest is connected to cattle farming and soybean plantation. So I started to look at this phenomenon through the eyes of land art and the transformation of the landscape that is done collectively as a society while we eat. So our food choices somehow define or create these land art pieces, right? These transformations on the landscape that are unintentional many times, that are not, let's say that I am in Rio de Janeiro right now, but what I'm eating here is maybe was grown in the Amazon. So it's not that disconnected, even though it's not in my visibility field, and I may not see what impact my food choices may have, but that doesn't mean that the sculpturability of my food choices are not present. So part of the image I was trying to create with that project was exactly this short circuit, this shortening of the distance between what is on our plate with what is happening on the surface of the land. And that was the project that I presented at the 32nd Biennial of São Paulo. And when I was invited in 2015 to participate in that exhibition, it was right after my postdoctoral research had finished, when I was, again, trying to relate agroecology to site specificity with a focus on agroforestry. I immediately told the curators that I would like to work with agroforestries, with food forests, which I will explain in the next slide what it is. So again, I revisited Robert Smithson, to understand how to go about this distance between, this is what you're seeing in the picture, is a building of glass and concrete, which is where the 32nd Biennial of São Paulo happens. So how could I possibly connect this very dry and modernist building to a food forest? How can I put in relation two situations that are so remote to each other? How, and I revisited Smithson's theory of the site non-site, right? How can distance become an ingredient or an important ingredient of the work, and put in motion a poetic approach, as if distance itself could also be a motor for the creation of language, images, and a work of art. So for those of you who don't know what a food forest is, it's the exact opposite of what a monoculture is. In a monoculture, what we are doing is, again, we're dictating to the land what it should produce, right? And for that to happen, I may have to correct the soil by adding ingredients, or not ingredients, fertilizers, and making the soil hospitable to the kind of culture that I would like to cultivate. What happens in a food forest is that instead of dictating to the land what it should produce, I will surf in what we call natural succession and observe the processes that are already ongoing and nature's tendency to build complexity. So instead of isolating one species, let's say if I isolate corn, anything that is not corn in a plantation will be considered invasive, right? That is the frame of mind of a monoculture. And in order for me to fight the invaders, I will use pesticides and heavy machinery. What happens in the food forest is a shift in perception of what natural processes, how natural processes behave and how multi-species relationships happen, so that I'm not fighting against these natural processes and there are no plants that are considered invaders. But what I will do in a food forest system is manage. That is the verb that is used by food foresters. I will manage, or I will mediate, the relationships between the species by pruning, cropping, and cutting the vegetation, so that I control where I want light to penetrate. So let's say that an avocado tree is overshadowing an orange tree. I will, if I want more orange than avocado, I can cut some of the branches from the avocado tree so that I get more light into my system. So I kind of decide where I want light to be in. And in that sense, I compare it to sculpture. Like this very traditional idea of sculpture, that, for example, when you're in front of a marble block and the sculptor sees a bird inside a marble block, and by subtracting matter, he or she will let the light free that bird that was envisioned. And in a way, sculpting, it is about management of light. So I kind of compare those two processes. What I found very interesting in this research about food forests is that, and this is a newspaper article that says that pre-Columbian civilizations shaped the vegetation of the Amazon. And I really liked when they used that word shape, because it again brings that idea of our modes of living having a sculptural impact on the landscape. So food forest is nothing new. It's something that is ancestral, that is, imagine the Amazon that we considered an icon of what a native forest would be, is not native at all. It had a lot of human influence. It really does not distinguish culture and nature. They are bound together to build that environment. So the idea of florestilidade or forestness in English came from a text that I translated in 2014 called An Introduction to Thinking Like a Forest. And for the author, food that is grown in a forest not only has the usual ingredients, right? The minerals, the vitamins, the calories that food does, but it has this extra ingredient, this extra, we can even say magic, that he called forestness. Which is exactly, again, referring back to that idea of food also as a picture of an environment, as a document of an environment. The food that is grown in a forest will tell the story of the forest. And the story is told not to our eyes, but to ourselves. And that is what I've been calling cellular mediation. So what I did in this project at the 32nd Biennial of Sao Paulo was the creation of a restaurant at that mezzanine that you saw in the first picture of the building of the Biennial Foundation, that was thought as a landing ground for the forest. So that was the way that I thought of the restaurant as a non-site of the forest, that the food that was grown in the forest would bring into the pavilion of the biennial the forestness, and somehow invite the public to participate in that system through eating the food through their digestive systems. We visited various food forests in the state of Sao Paulo. Many of them were also connected to the largest social movement in Latin America called the Landless Workers Movement, whom I'm still working with today in a project called Voicescapes for the Landless. We were documenting these forests that we visited, not only using photography, because photography is not very useful in the forest. I like to tell an anecdote of an indigenous person that was asked if he had ever seen a jaguar. And he answered, if I had seen a jaguar, I wouldn't be here. Because when you see something in the forest, that means it's already too close. You should hear it, you should listen to it. The way that your perception is able to have a much wider, let's say, view of the forest is not through the eyes, because especially in a tropical forest, it is dense. It doesn't let the eye travel much. The view in the forest, the eyes or the vision is very shallow. It is your ears, it is your listening that is really able to perceive the environment. So we very early in the project, we understood that, and we decided to record the soundscapes and the biophonies and the acoustic signatures, which are especially strong at sunrise and sunset, when really you have an immense orchestra of all the species together, which is also a way to measure the biodiversity of these forests. So to test our hypothesis that the food forests are very diverse environments, we stopped at monocultures to do the same. Let's record what monocultures have to tell in terms of their soundscape. And it was one of the heaviest silences I have ever heard in my life. You really don't hear anything in a monoculture, apart from sometimes the leaves rubbing against each other because of the wind. But there's very, very few species. Every now and then there's a bird that goes by, but it's nothing compared to the sound of a complex environment, such as a food forest. And this is the kind of desertification that happens to the land in a monoculture. The soil really loses life. So just for you to have an idea of what the restaurant looked like, the tables were collective, so people would eat together. I also collaborated with a group of artists and architects to build the furniture that somehow resembled what we call the extracts of the forest. So the farther up you are, the more exposure to light you have, the closer to the ground, the less light you get. Through the materials, people could listen to the soundscapes as they ate. And this lecture usually works better before lunch, so people are more attracted to the food that I show. Our dishes were very biodiverse, and really, to tell the stories of the forest. As I said, we worked with principles of solidarity economy. This was our main dish. It was called the landscape jar. So it worked in layers, just like the forest. At the bottom, we usually had the roots and then the greens. So the food was served in trays like that. And we received food from the food forest once a week. And the farmers came and spoke in public lectures, very wise and interesting lectures, and farmers who have a lot to say. This was our last dish. We had 7 kinds of bananas in a dish called moqueca de banana in Brazil, which is like a layered. So this is the kind of diversity we used to get, which was like really so much fun and lively. And this is the last slide of Restauro. It is supposed to be a funny slide, like you're trying to listen to bananas, but it also expresses a bit of this idea of an expanded approach to the listening methodology, that we're not only listening to literal sound, but listening as a mode of relating to sight that is not dictatorial and is not imposing an a priori truth or perception, but it's somehow approaching a site with what we could call a bioavailable attitude that would somehow be receptive to perceiving and noticing the life that is already there, that is perhaps not so centered around the human. And the last slide, if you remember the first one, which was Escultura Ambiental, the first one of Restauro, right? This project, and that is why I kept it in Portuguese, because in Portuguese the word escultura, which means sculpture, has a gift for us, which if you subtract, or if you sculpt 3 letters out of escultura, you find the word escuta, which means listening. So I thought it was an interesting way of connecting environmental listening to environmental sculpture through an investigation or an examination of language. I call this process also a pedagogy of the forest, And these are the slides, the annotations that I made in order for me also to create a system out of all these concepts that I have been working with. And just to finish, and to tell you, this Restauro project began in 2016, but more recently, and in a residency in the Netherlands, that happened in 2019, 2020, what I was trying to do is to create, again, a non-site or an extension of the Restauro project that would land on the page. A lot of the discursive aspect of the Restauro project was really repressed or contained at the biennial in 2016 because we wanted food to be the protagonist. So when the public entered the restaurant, there were no texts or pictures about the forest because it was the food that was going to tell the story of the forest. And that created an awkward situation because sometimes many people would enter the restaurant and not realize at all that that was an art project and that was part of the curatorial frame. But it was a risk that we thought was important for us to take. So all the stories, the verbal stories and all the research that had been put into it was somehow delayed and postponed to a later stage when we wanted to make a publication, a book, which ended up being a magazine that is called Enzyme, which we published in the Netherlands. And the challenge for us was to think of it in terms of surfaces. So how can the surface of the land relate to the surface of the table? So that was an existing equation in Restauro, right? When we were thinking, what is the impact that of what is on my plate has on the land, right? We were short-circuiting those two surfaces. But now we wanted to add an extra layer, which was the page. So how can the surface of the page relate to the surface of the earth and to the surface of the table in articulations such as how can I cultivate the surface of the page, or how can I read the surface of the land, and how can I write on the surface of the land and read the surface of the table, for example. And one of the interesting things that happened in the research is that we found out that the word page comes from, has the same etymology of paysage or paisagem in Portuguese. So landscape and page share an etymological relation, let's say, right? So we were really thinking about the page, again, not only as a support for a priori ideas, but also as a constitutive element of all that we were trying to convey. So that was it that I brought. I'm open for questions, and I would love to continue the conversas that Vesna introduced, the conversations, so that I'm not talking alone here. I would again like to thank you so much for this invitation. This is my Instagram and my email. If you want to email me, feel free. Sometimes I take a little while to answer, but I do answer them. So
Jorgge, that was fabulous. I love the way you think. I love the fact that you use art historical, like you put it all into context by using an art historical context, like using Smithson, but turning it into something that's, in my opinion, so much far beyond what Smithson did, not to lessen what Smithson did because it was important in its time, but you pulled it into the contemporary, which I really, really enjoy. So I just want to say thank you. I'm going to open it up for questions, but I think Jerry has to do that. But I want to say this. This is just an anecdote. And I don't know if you remember when you were drying the nettle in the garage. some neighbors came to visit. They had, they wanted to talk to me. And I heard later that they all thought that we were drying pot, and they were like, okay, the artists are over, the commune artists are over there drying pot. And it was like a big deal. And I had to explain to them that it was not pot, it was nettle. I mean, anyway, it was kind of interesting. It was kind of fun, but
that's amazing. I have forgotten that.
Yeah, and I look forward to really getting this project off the ground and getting it going. I mean,
yeah,
we've been closed down for 2 years because of the pandemic, and I can't wait till you're back at the UC Santa Cruz. So then we have a closer relationship. One question might be like, is there a vision for that program? Are you helping define what that program is, or is it already sort of defined? Because I know there's some people probably in the audience that might be interested in graduate school, and they're going to have a graduate program in environmental art. So I'm just curious if you want to just address that a little bit.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that, Mel. I was just thinking that we didn't try to smoke the stinging nettles, right? But the program that I was hired to teach in at UCSC, the reason why I was hired was because of the launch of a new MFA program that is called Environmental Art and Social Practice, which is being launched this Friday. Like the first course that we're teaching will begin this very Friday. It is very much defined. Our first cohort it's quite small. We're just beginning, so it's only 8 students that we have in the first cohort, and it is, of course, in a special location because UCSC's campus is inside the forest. You know how California has been struggling with environmental issues, so it is a special place to think about all these the climate change and the impact of humans on the landscape, and somehow I think California is already in the future of what our future as a planet might be like. So it is also a let's say a hotspot, literally. To think about all those issues, and of course UCSC has a tradition of environmentalists and social justice initiatives. So we're all like super happy. It took 15 years for this MFA to take off, to get off the ground, and so everyone's really excited about it, and I am totally like happy about it, and also because of the reason that I will be closer to you, Mel, so that we can continue collaborating in future projects. And this is something that I think is really, really important to say, especially in the context of the pandemic that we're coming out of, is how we are also being pushed to thinking about formats that are not only based on exhibition formats for artistic practices, and which have a different temporality, a different duration, and that can work in the long term. So those ideas are very dear to me, and I think especially nowadays when social gatherings have become a danger, right? We should also be considering other kinds of formats, which may come from these long-term projects that have one foot in the academia and one foot in the art system or in the art world, let's say.
Right. Great. Thank you. I think we should just turn it over to other people. I'm not going to call on anybody because I can't see everybody.
I have a question, Mel.
Go ahead.
So thank you, Jorge. This was fabulous, and to hear you speak and to hear, I mean, about just thinking about how different media works, but also as Mel points, you know, how that listening in the forest is actually seeing, kind of understanding these phenomena in entirely new ways or different ways. Not something that we're used to, but something that we are just simply confronted with and we have to deal with. And so looking into one of the, and I couldn't really find your contribution to the Mold magazine that you have done. And that's something that I found very, very curious that one of the collaborators who works with food, Johnny Drain, writes about the fermentation story in one of these magazines about the Jewish emigres arriving to New York in the late 19th century and how they used a piece of fabric and submerged it and soaked it into yogurt and sort of like left it there in order to reanimate the culture in a new homeland. And so I wonder how, if you can tell us a little bit about how these, and you talked about enzyme and how the page becomes a landscape and it's very beautiful and poetic, but how does that displacement from one culture into the other culture works for you when it comes to the idea of homeland and being, you know, finding yourself in Netherlands, but now in the Brazil, but going on to California, and kind of like understanding what is the role of geography in your work?
Oh, thank you so much, Vesna, for that great question. I think you touched upon a very, very important aspect of my work. And it begins, I think it begins much earlier than my own, let's say, displacements around the globe. I think it begins with the colonial period of Brazil, when the Portuguese come to Brazil and they do the opposite of what a site-specific practice would be, right? What they do is that they impose a language and they impose habits and they dictate to the land what it should produce and how people should speak. And this erasure of a contextual intelligence that was there present and very much related to the forests or to thinking like a forest, right? Because these peoples, they would inhabit the forest is really, really like a trauma, let's say a colonial trauma that we're still trying to heal. And sometimes I see my work also as an attempt to respond to these kinds of colonial traumas that are inherited by several for centuries. So just to give you an example of how violent that the colonization in Brazil is in terms of language, also, and image making, image formation. The word forest itself, in Portuguese, it's floresta, which is the same etymology of forest in English, right? And in the etymology, floresta or forest means out there, means something that I am detached from. It comes from foris. So imagine when the Portuguese come to Brazil and when they see those complex ecosystems and when they call them forest, it is of an immense violence because they are separating culture from nature with that action of calling those places forest. And they're turning those complex ecosystems into resources that are at the service of culture and ignoring the hundreds of names that the indigenous peoples had to call those complex ecosystems in several different languages that were not at all related to something that they were detached from, because they were living in the forest, from the forest, with the forest, and all the species that that build the forest with them. So we, you know, it's the deconstruction that we like when we were trying to reconnect the pavilion of the biennial to the forest, it was also a way to say, look, this is not a forest, right? This is not out there. This is not something I'm detached from. What I'm eating in the pavilion might deforest the Amazon. So these complex images that we're trying to recreate by, and I think that is very much related to what artists' role in the environmental debate is about creating language, images, and figures of speech that are complex enough for us to think about such complex matters. If I continue calling the forest, I am simplifying it, and I will never be able to solve the deforestation problem. Language has an active role in that debate, and I think it is the artists who are responsible, artists and educators who are responsible for forging this new language, these new images, these new repertoires and vocabulary, so that we can address these issues with more complexity and do the opposite of the simplification that the colonial process imposed upon us.
So other questions, just go ahead and speak up.
Just one.
Hi.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. You can.
No, I wanted to say that in Serbia, where I'm from, we eat nettle soup. So we do a lot of, and it's just a delicacy. It's so important and super healthy. So something to consider in Sand Hills on the next round.
I forgot to say that when we dehydrate the nettles, they lose their stinginess. So that's important to say. Just like when you cook, right, Vesna? When you cook, they lose their stinginess.
Benjamin, did you have something to say?
Yeah, this is a kind of a more broad question. First of all, I want to thank the art department for doing this, because I'm not in your department, but this was so wonderful for me. It's so connected to a lot of the material I'm teaching in my classes this semester. I teach Portuguese, and we just read Torto Arado in my Brazilian culture class. So I kind of wanted to ask a question of Dr. Barreto, Dr. Jorgge. Could you kind of comment on the deeper interest in food, and maybe more particularly in kind of traditional knowledge when it comes to food preparation? Because I've noticed, I've had, maybe about 20 years that I'm, going to Brazil frequently and working, and I feel like this moment there's been a lot of really passionate interest in kind of food, and it's not only in, art, but in kind of discussions of economics, discussion in literature. I think part of what makes Torto Arado the novel, which is this novel that came out 2 years ago, that's kind of the novel that everybody's talking about right now, that is about a community in the northeast of Brazil that is kind of being they're kind of being like galvanized by the landless workers movement, and there's a lot about traditional knowledge and the way it works with food. So I guess that's something I'd like to talk about, is maybe if you, are you noticing the kind of thought that you're bringing to the art world in the arts world more broadly in Brazil right now? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Benjamin, for that question. It's really interesting, because I think it also brings into, let's say, a broader cultural perspective, right? And allows me to also speak about my research in terms of a multidisciplinary approach that is not only in the arts, but in a broader cultural perspective and including other areas. I think there's something really important in Brazil regarding the modernist period that is often overlooked, which is the idea of anthropophagy. And I think, for the modernisms, for the modernists in Brazil, which is in the beginning of last century, they were really thinking. They really wanted to reimagine the idea of anthropophagy or cannibalism as a way of colonized countries to absorb and build something new out of, let's say, a foreign influence. So it would be a way of critically assimilating a foreign culture, and they use this ritual that used to be practiced in some indigenous tribes in Brazil of eating the enemy in order to absorb their power. So they were not practicing cannibalism because they were hungry, but it was it was a ritual in order for you to gain the power of your enemy, and in a way for you to learn something from them, right? And I think this of course it's a metaphor that the modernists were using to somehow think about decoloniality, if you wish. But I think the metaphor refers back to the stomach, refers back to the digestive system, and to a way of building identity and an intellect that is not so much centered around your head or your vision, but it's centered around your digestive systems. So it's not just a metaphor, right? It's not by accident that they were eating and they were not just chatting or discussing or asking their enemies to teach their tricks. They were really, when I thought about the cellular mediation, it's really about this learning ability that our cells have, learning and unlearning, right? Because if we're eating from monoculture, we're also erasing a lot of the complexity that we have. So I do think that by eating more wild edibles, we may become more wild and disobedient. And when we're eating monoculture, we are more easily controlled and become more obedient. So I do feel that our cells do have an ability to learn from what we eat. And so yeah, I think this is something of a historical aspect that I have thought about. And just to add to your, I have bought the book you mentioned, but I haven't read it yet. It's on my pile of books to read. Thank you so much, Benjamin, for that question.
Oh, thank you for that answer. It was really, really great.
We do have one question from Jana Harper.
Okay, Jana.
Hi there. I'm so happy you're here. I also teach in the Department of Art with these amazing colleagues, and Mel has just been talking about you for years. I got to go to the Sandhills Institute this summer, and so when you were talking about the project, I was just picturing you there and the landscape. And I just want to say, like, I wish you were here because I feel like there's so much to talk about. You're making me think about Maria Teresa Alves' work and how many crossovers there are. And I love Brazilian conceptualism. There's like, a million people to talk about. But I'm also thinking about this article that I read recently, an old article by a law professor at Harvard named Christopher Stone. Maybe you've read it, about do trees have standing? And it's kind of asking this legal question about what rights do trees have? What rights do the forest have?
Yeah.
And, there's so little discussion of that. And especially in this moment where, our waters are threatened and, so many things in the natural world are threatened. And I think, indigenous cultures intrinsically understand that when you believe that something is animate, that it has rights. But this is something that colonial culture doesn't even consider. And but really my question is much more practical, and it has to do with our students, because many of them are starting a project on participation. And I think that your practice is so complicated, and it's both intellectual, it's practical, it's on the ground, it's theoretical, you're bringing so many things together. But my question really is on behalf of our students, like, how do you begin to talk about participation in your work with students who are just starting to think about this as incorporating this into their practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I can think about it with you. I don't think I can answer it, but I do think, Jenna. Oh, and by the way, thank you so much for your question and your comment on this idea of the forest rights and the trees rights. I followed the work of Paulo Tavares, who has an amazing work. He lived in Ecuador, where the forest is part of the constitution and has constitutional rights. I think it's probably the first country where nature actually has an active legal voice, let's say, to protect itself, and can even sue someone, right? A river can sue a company, for example.
I think also New Zealand has this.
Yeah, I think there are some countries. I know more about the Latin American context, but I think it's something that is definitely related, and I imagine in New Zealand about with the ancestral populations that live there, which exactly have that kind of perspective. I think it's amazing, and there are anthropologists that have been doing work in that direction, such as Tsing, who the book I just translated, the Mushroom at the End of the World, which was mentioned by Vesna as well. So I'm really excited that you brought that up, because it's totally in tune of where I'm trying to look at as well. And the question of being an educator as well, right? I think your question is also provoking me to think in those terms. I think an important aspect of art that I find very frequently necessary for us to work in the classroom, so that we can think about the art object more in terms of its complexity and less in terms of its intrinsic properties, is the deconstruction, right, of the autonomy of the art object. I think it is related to that, and once we begin deconstructing the art object as an autonomous and self-contained object, I think we start building those relationships, and participation is one of them, right? Site specificity is another one. Collaboration is another one. So you're kind of like shifting the focus from something that is self-referential and self-contained to the context. That has been the road that I've been taking, I think, in my classes. And recently in an environmental large studio class, we even began through our guts, when I discovered that 90% of the cells that inhabit our bodies are not human. 90%, we are 90% non-human. That really, you know, just shifts the perspective of how we relate to the world, not as, you know, self-contained but yeah, but I would love to hear you more about that. And I hope that next time I'm able to come in person, and we can think of bridges to connect our departments and
Well, good
think of
luck with
projects
your
together.
good luck with your new program. That sounds amazing, and maybe we'll cross paths at the Sandhills Institute.
Yes, yes, that would be lovely. and have nettle soup.
Perfect. I love it.
I don't want to keep this going too much longer, but if there are any other pressing questions, I had one comment because I kind of think your work is so timely, and it frustrates me when, you know, we talk about environmental issues and the importance of, you know, global warming, and it seems to all focus on fossil fuels. And the interesting thing is food production is probably one of the biggest problems with an ecosystem that is not, you know, dealing with global warming and so on. And so in a way, but even some people's approach, like, you know, the whole notion of the impossible burger, to me is so wrong. It's just the wrong approach. Or the idea of growing meat in a warehouse, it's the wrong approach. And so when you look at your work and you think about how they look at it and how they see it, but then what you're doing, I mean, there's a world of difference. And to me, more people should be thinking like you and less like the guy who invented the impossible burger, because I just don't think that kind of thinking is going to get us to the place that we need to be when it comes to food production. So I don't know if you have any comments on that, but I also, are there other questions as well?
Yeah, thank you for that, Mel. I think you addressed such an important way for us, that we as a culture, we try to solve things by replacing the problem with another problem, but we're still like in the same logic. And I think the impossible burger is exactly that. You're replacing a commodity by another commodity, and you're not questioning the system. And I do think that artists and thinkers and educators, we have such a huge responsibility in this suggestion of thinking in through different paradigms. And we have the history of art with us, right? Helping us to really build these images and build language that will somehow support us in looking at the world through a more complex lens. I think it's such a challenge. I don't see my work as an answer, really. I think we're trying to come up with ways to suggest possibilities. But I do think we as artists have an immense role in the environmental debate, and fortunately, many artists are willing to play that role with seriously and with ethics. I think is a big part of this whole discussion, right?
Yeah. Great. I think we'll end it there unless there's any pressing questions. And I'm going to ask that the senior art majors, and Jorgge, why don't you stay on just a little bit longer? We'll end it for everyone else, and maybe we can work out some scheduling. Thank you so much. It was brilliant. It was really wonderful. And we will figure out a way to get you up here. It would be really great to have you here. So anyway.
Thank you so much.
Share you with other departments as well. So